This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and dealing with some of the stuff that can get in the way of that. If you're a Christian, you know that going to church is a big part of the Christian life. Meeting with other Christians, finding ways to help our communities, and learning more about the teachings of Jesus. Have you ever felt uneasy though, or even distracted by the way churches are run? Do the financial mechanics of the business of church make you uncomfortable sometimes? You've seen the opulence of some mega churches and their pastors and wondered, is this the way it's supposed to be? Nathan Apffel is the director of The Religion Business, an upcoming documentary series examining the evolution of institutionalised Christianity and its resemblance to Jesus. Informed by the American system, Nathan's quest for financial transparency, accountability, so far has seen him arrested, accused of hating church, but it's also led him to re-examine what a life following Jesus and really impacting others is meant to look like, and the shape that church can take within that. You can follow the series at Religion Business on Instagram, but right now, let's welcome Nathan to the show. You started filming for this 12 years ago. What was it back then that was really agitating you about church?
I was raised in a kind of standard non-denominational megachurch. And I don't know if there's anything standard about that concept, but my dad was a flying angel. I in the Christmas pageant, I sang in choir till I was 13. I've done everything from Awanas to, youth groups and youth camps. And it was in my early 20s, that I had a couple really personal experiences that I just started questioning the institution. But then I've been working in travel TV since I was 18, so 22 years. And as I would travel around the world, I'd go to seminaries and churches just all over the world. And I just wanted to kind of get that flair and flavor of Christianity. So I ended up in, the favelas, the poorest parts of Brazil, at churches there and seminaries there. I ended up in like drug running regions of Honduras and little tin roof churches there. And I ended up in churches in China. And every time I'd come back, it just made me question the business model. And when I say business model, just the real undergirding business model of I'll say the American Christian church, but Australia's, let's call it the institution, runs kind of similar. And as I started unpacking that, just the business side of it, not the theological side, but strictly the business side, some really glaring moments in history sprang up where I'm like, oh, this is why the church is the way it is. It's no one person's fault or one person in Congress's idea. It's just, I understand why the church, the institution, is culminated where it's at. And so I was about 28 years old when I decided to make the show, and I got the domain, The Religion Business, when I was 26. So it's a 15 years in the making show.
Yeah. So is there an issue with churches, with religion being a business? Is there something fundamentally wrong about that? Or is it something just that you just personally have an issue with?
Well, when you read the Bible, which is, the show's 8 hours. And the reason why it's 8 hours is you have to unpack this idea of religion as a business. You look at Israel and what was happening with the Mosaic laws and the purpose of those laws. You have to look at what Judaism and politics were doing at the time. And you have to move through these moments in history to understand the current system today. And so the opening line, the hard open of the show is, I got arrested and I'm being interrogated. And the first question they asked me was, why do you hate church? And my answer was, well, what is church? And that is what starts the whole journey, because we have to be able to define it if we want to kind of understand the nuance of the system, so to speak. And so I'll spoil a little of the show. Like, I want institutional church to call itself a business because it is. I got to sit down with a gentleman named Philip Hackney. He oversaw the nonprofit sector for the IRS. So you're talking about the smartest lawyer in the United States that understands the regulations. And I said, hey, are these churches a business? And he's like, well, no, sort of. And this is in the show. And I say, okay, what's a business? And he goes, a business is when you have money going in and money going out. And I'm like, well, then a church, per your own definition, is a business. So when the smartest lawyer in the US can't call it a business, and then 99 out of 100 other people that I ask can't call it a business, that's a real problem, because then you don't hold it to the standards that you hold a normal business to regarding accountability and responsibility and either shareholder or stakeholder value. And so we actually, in the show, I say we need to call a spade and call it a business. If there's money coming in and money going out, it's a business enterprise. And once we can call it that, we can look at it and actually say, okay, how should this be ran ethically, morally, with accountability and all that.
And also in some of the teaser content for this series, you've talked on that. It seems to be an issue of transparency, right? Like if churches who operate at a level that does appear as a business were happy to say, yes, we are a business, they could actually be run as more effective businesses. Like you have your $2 million building project, make that building an investment that works for you, not something that's just saved up for a Sunday.
100%. Well, and that's what I think. It takes 8 hours to unpack, but when you can't call it a business, you can't run it shrewdly. And you're speaking about like how to run something shrewdly and efficiently. The buildings are a great example. It's in America, the physical church building is the greatest physical asset the church has, but they sit empty 80-something% of the time. If you ran it like a business, you would never want an asset, your greatest asset, sitting just deteriorating empty. And so the show spurs these ideas, and we travel around the US and the world in the show, and you see really good examples and then really bad examples of things just like that, where there's buildings being used 20 hours a day, 7 days a week for local co-ops and local nonprofits. There's a church that I'll get into a story that rubbed me wrong. It's a church that a couple of my family friends go to. And they were so proud. They said, Nathan, we spent $3 million on our new children's facility. And I'm like, okay, that's awesome. And at the same time, they were marching for pro-life advocacy. And I said, okay, so you've got this $3 million building and you're marching for pro-life. Like, what do you guys have for single mothers? What are you guys doing for this niche that has a massive need? And they're like, well, we're marching on the steps of the Capitol. I'm like, have you ever thought about opening this $3 million facility up to single mothers and bring some people in? So, hey, maybe it's free daycare for local single mothers or whatever, but you've just made this massive investment. And they're like, oh no, we wouldn't want to destroy it. And I'm like, oh man, I'm like, just think through that. Like you have such an opportunity to actually create impact in this vulnerable community. But instead you think, hey, we'll march into the Capitol and that'll be our what we'll do. It's almost like we don't know what we don't know.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, how do we reactivate in our communities? And instead of just being the flag wavers, actually get involved and utilize the assets that, if you're a Christian, that God's given you. How do you milk every dollar given to you? I mean, when you can call it a business, you can run it shrewdly and efficiently.
Yeah, and this idea of church as a business or even something that has such community impact, perhaps each of us have come to that idea from our own backstory, our own experiences with church. But what do you find the Bible says? What does Jesus say about what the church is, who we're meant to be?
Oh man, that's I've been sick for the last 2.5 weeks now. And sometimes I feel like God slows me down. And my business partner said it. He's like, hey, this is God slowing you down for a sec. And so I have a lot of Bibles, but I pulled out my red line Bible and I said, I'm only reading Christ's words for the next 2.5 weeks. And I sat there and I did 3 passes through just his words in the New Testament. And when you do that, you realize his teachings, he didn't have this huge Rolodex of teachings. It's very simple. And the show is based on Matthew 25, really, where Christ says, you fed me when I was hungry. You gave me water when I was thirsty. You clothed me when I was naked. You visited me when I was sick. You visited me when I was in prison. And then Christ has this really unique obsession with the orphans and the widows, And so he was always there for the marginalized or the needy. And it's very straightforward when you look at Christ's teachings. It's the least of these that he was there to help. He didn't come for the righteous. He came for the sinner and the least of these. And when you just look at the data, which we present in the show, the church is the institution is the antithesis to that. So 94 cents of every dollar is used on ourselves and on the institution, and then only 6 cents of every dollar makes it outside the institutional walls now to help that laundry list of individuals that Christ commanded us to help. And so we present the argument that the model needs to be flipped and it needs to be inverted. 94 cents should be going out. And sure, businesses have overhead and operations and people need to be paid and all that. We don't really care about that, but it's like this 44 cents of every dollar given to the institutional Christian church now just goes to salaries.
Wow.
And you're like, what are we doing? And then that goes back to that hard open question in the show. What is a church? And you learn about that. And from the United States perspective, what you see as a church is actually the 14-point checklist that the IRS created, which is so weird to think that what we call a church is actually made by the IRS. It's a corporate entity created by the IRS.
It's so bizarre and so far from the picture, I suppose, of Jesus with his disciples, Jesus doing this very down-to-earth, grounded thing. It does feel like the modern reflection of church can look so different from that. And that is a generalization. Of course, there are wonderful churches doing really great things. Don't want to overlook that. But I wonder in this process as well, if it's something that has made you rethink the way that we use tithe, for instance. For a lot of people, when you think of church and money, one of the big things you, of course, think about is this idea of tithing, giving 10%. Do you think that the tithe then is meant to go to the institution and wages, or should the tithe be almost, should it be rethought as something that goes to the people and the work they're doing within the community as the church?
Yeah, so this was my hang up. So when I was... ever since I can remember, my mom made, Nathan, you got to give 10% to your church. And I did that all throughout my childhood. And I thought I was going to get more money. I was going to give money and I was going to get more money. And then I just stopped tithing in my teens. And then I started traveling, like I said, with travel TV. And I did a lot of work in the nonprofit sector. And I really saw how far a dollar could go in Africa and in Central and South America, in Asia. And I'm like, man, there's I want to help, I want to give, I want to sponsor these children. I want to do X, Y, and Z. And so this idea of tithe, this 10% giving to the temple is what I'm going to call it, because that is what, if you look at the Mosaic laws, it says we dissect this concept of tithe, this biblical concept. I sit down with Jewish scholars. I sit down with Christian scholars. I sit down with Christian and Jewish historians. The tithe is the most misunderstood, misused, and I'm going to use a hard word here, and bastardized law from the Mosaic covenants. It's totally steered the institutional church today off course. And the reason why I say that is, and I have the leading scholar in the world on this in the show. His name's David Croto. He wrote a book, Why I Don't Have to Tithe. And when you look at the biblical tithes, and he's a Christian, he's a dean of a seminary, but when you look at the Mosaic laws, there's not one tithe. And we have to remember that tithe means 10%. There's 3. So if you want to preach tithe, you need to preach 3 tithes. 2 happened every year and 1 happened, the charity tithe was every 3rd year. So technically you can't ask for 10%. You need to ask for about 23.3% if you're going to preach tithing. But then the kicker is tithing had nothing to do with money. Absolutely nothing. So, and there were a lot of people will say, oh yeah, well, it was an agrarian culture back then. No, they had currency. But when you look at the Mosaic covenants, God, if you believe the story, God gave Israel to the Israelites. They didn't earn it. They didn't buy it. It was a gift. And so God gave them these laws as commandments back. And one of those laws was this idea of tithe. But tithing came off the land. So when you read Leviticus and you read all this, if you didn't own land, you did not tithe to the temple. He asked for 10% of your crops God asks for 10% of your crops and your cattle and your livestock off your land. You'd bring it to the temple. The Levites would break it down. And I'm a hunter, so this is where it gets really fun, is I understand the work it takes to break down an animal. So I understand the time and energy the Levites would put in, hours to process one animal.
Yeah.
And then if you really dive into the laws, the Levites would get a portion of the animal so they could eat. And then the tither, if you were the tither, Laura, you'd get a portion of it back. You and your family would eat that portion of the tithe. And so it was a way to, number one, get food and sustenance to the Levites as they were volunteering in the temple. But then it was also a way, the charity tithe was another 10% of crops and cattle. And you'd bring that, and that was for the poor and the needy. And then the other tithe was the festival tithe. So you'd literally bring another 10%, and then you'd party and have fun, and you'd throw the festivals, and you'd enjoy these massive meals. And hey, guess what? If the festival was too far away and I couldn't bring my grain, I would sell it, take that money, go to where the festival was, and buy whatever I wanted. And it says beer, wine, whatever I wanted, and I would enjoy this festival. And so when you look at the Mosaic tithes, they had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with what came off the land, because that land was a gift. And those tithes were strictly for Jewish landowners of the tribes. And so everybody who ever says, hey, Nathan, should I tithe? I'm like, if you're speaking about the Mosaic tithes, unless you're a Jew that lives in Israel that owns land, no, because it has nothing to do with you. The idea of tithe is cultural, and you have to place it in its cultural context. Now, this is the cool part. Christ speaks very broadly about who to help, how to give. So there are New Testament principles in regards to giving and generosity. But this idea of 10% tithe it actually disappeared in America. And we present this in the show. Historically, there is no record of any church asking for a tithe until after the Civil War. Right. Because churches back then, like in the founding of America, and as the Pilgrims and everybody pushed west, and they brought their King James Bibles in their wagon, they would build a church, and sure, you'd give some money into the back offering box, but there was no sense of there's no concept of tithing until the Civil War happened, and then America was just poor, and all churches were poor, and a lot of pastors dipped back into the Mosaic law at this point and said, okay, how can we bring revenues in? And that's when they fell back onto the Mosaic laws, and that's when tithing came roaring back. Tithing is just very misunderstood.
Yes, and it's something that does need context around it. And I like the point you bring up that Jesus does make it really clear for us in modern times then where to aim our generosity and how to actually reflect his intention. Because churches practically, of course, need finance, but it's nice to think that we would filter it through a lens of where is this finance going to go? How is this going to directly impact someone in need on the other side, as opposed to how's it going to make sure I have an air-conditioned building to sit in on Sunday, which I think is probably a good thing to consider.
Well, when you read like Paul and all Paul's letters, they gathered money, but they were pooling all their resources to help poor churches and poor communities. That was it. They would pool it, and they would go to Jerusalem and those Christian communities in need, and that is where they were giving their resources to the people in need.
Yes.
I sit down with one of the top 5 megachurch pastors in the U.S. I don't want to spoil it, but he's preached at Hillsong, he's preached at all the C3 conferences, legend of a pastor. His average congregation was 20,000 members, and he had a huge kind of awakening, so to speak. And he goes, Nathan, I was standing on stage one Easter, and I had this Messianic Jew friend of his come up to give Passover. And he goes, I felt Christ speak to me. And he goes, for the first time ever, I realized I've pushed the least of these out of my church to build the institution. And he goes, the very people I was called, and he was a missionary in Brazil first. And he goes, the very people I wanted to help and preach the gospel to, 20 years later, I just kicked out of my church and completely pushed them off because they brought no added value to me or the institution.
And the moment you bring something up like that, it's going to make some people think, and even him saying that, it's going to make some people think you're trying to pull apart church in a way. You're trying to I don't want to say the word deconstruction because it means so many other things. But I just mean you're trying to destroy what currently exists in some way. But it sounds like his intention, even your intention, it doesn't sound like you were trying to negatively pull apart church. It's almost like a reorientation of the foundations of our faith.
Correct. I would just say a recommitment. It's like, and I can't stand the word deconstruct because there's really no definition to it, but we've missed the mark. And, sin, like the idea of biblical sin, is just missing the mark. And the institution is officially missing the mark. And here's why. The Christian church, funded by generous Christian givers, and Christian givers are the most generous people in the world, have enough annual resources to solve the majority of global social issues. And it would affect, this is what's crazy, no one's bottom line. This is where it gets wild when you start thinking about accountability. You look at the theft within the institutional walls, then we profile 10 major loopholes in the IRS code. In the US, where about 200 billion with a B just disappears every year. And you say, okay, let's stop the theft and then stop the majority of that bleed into those loopholes. The American Christian Church alone could fund the top 30 global social issues and eradicate them.
Wow. Yeah. I just can't believe that much money goes missing either.
Well, this is what's sad. So I'm going to spoil something for you. 53 billion with a B is just straight stolen every year. So that's what's put into the coffers on a Sunday, counted in the back room, and then deposited in the bank on a Monday. The delta between what's counted and what's deposited is that 53 billion. Here's what's scarier. That number was from 2022. The statisticians that run this think tank just released their 2025 numbers. That's jumped up to 92 billion.
Wow.
And it's because there's just no accountability. And as denominations die, so denominationalism is dying. It's on just a spiral death roll, but non-denominationalism is rising at the same time. And so as the denominations die, so does the accountability within those systems. So even though those systems weren't perfect, if I had a problem, I could go to my local association or convention and say, hey, I feel like my pastor's stealing or something shady is going on. And they would come in and either do an audit or, open an investigation. And non-denominationalism is the Wild West. So you have one entity now that we call it religious economic theory in the show, but you're running as fast as you can and you're spending as much as you can to outcompete the church down the street from you. Since there's no accountability, external accountability systems holding you to account, the machine just runs away on its operators is how we say it. And before you know it, your budget's $80 million a year and you don't know where 14 million of it went. So what do? You just put it in your pie chart as ministry and you're like, whatever, somewhere over there. You know what I mean? Like I have a pastor in the show. I say, how big was your budget last year? And he's like, I don't know, 30 to 40 million bucks. And I'm like, well, is it 30 or is it 40? Like, how do you not know your budget? Like that's $10 million of donor funds that you can't even account for. And you run the machine. So it's no one person's fault. It's like the IRS created these systems. Most of it is through precedent. It's not even law or regulation. And we've just adopted it. And our generation is now growing up saying, oh yeah, this is church.
Yes.
When in reality, it's 2 decades old and, it is what it is.
One of the things that strikes me is that for the most, if we want to give a pastor of a large church the benefit of the doubt, right? The most sincere will say that they're wanting to create this kind of environment for people to have a wonderful space to encounter Christ, to be with a huge community and feel that sense of, enjoyment in what it means to come to church. For you, though, having seen church at that scale and also at some of the smaller scales in all of these different places that you've mentioned, where do you most sense God? In what kind of environment do you feel like God is most present?
I'll preface it with God works all things together for good. And I firmly believe that. I believe the institution is selling something that is not Christ-centered. Christ told you to pick up your cross and follow him. He told the wealthiest to give up their resource. And what he was doing is he was telling you to sacrifice. You need to sacrifice for your brother. The greatest law of all is love love no other God before me than love your neighbor as yourself. And we talk about this in the show. There's a gentleman named Carl Trueman, brilliant Reformation thought expert. He's an Orthodox Christian, probably the smartest brain in the world on the Reformation and what was happening with Luther and Calvin and Zwingli. He had me read this book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. It's written by a gentleman named Philip Reef in the 60s, I believe. And he basically defines humanity in these 4 stages: political man, religious man, economic man, and then psychological man. And when you map these 4 stages over Judaism and Christianity, you see how the mind of the culture at the time, whether that be Rome or Europe or now America, and what's happening culturally, the church kind of adapts to it. And we live in this age of psychological man, where everything about me, about Nathan, has to be affirmed. And so churches have adopted that. So the music makes you feel good. The sermons make you feel good. The childcare makes you feel good that your kids are being taught something.
Yeah.
I get very I don't necessarily like my daughter going to kids groups because she watches a movie and they give her a sucker and say, good job. And I'm like, what is this? I'd much rather go volunteer with her at a food pantry or, at a homeless outreach because then at least you're integrated into this idea of service. But the sacrificial side of the church has kind of gone to the wayside, serving each other, like having a meal together, a shared meal, baptism, the Eucharist, like all these things have taken a back seat to the show, for lack of a better term. And so I think bluntly, we're selling a false gospel. And when I say we're, it's a very broad brush that I'm painting with, but the institution can't sell the message of Christ. Because if you sell a message of sacrifice and a message
not
of
as appealing,
repentance, it's not that appealing. But the brilliant part of the show is I've gotten to travel the world and find those individuals and these communities that are living that out 24/7. And I'm hoping that these individuals and these churches inspire, let's call them Western institutional churches, to say, hey, why don't we adopt this practice or what they're doing? And the goal is really to educate and let people ask questions and bring the power back to the donor. And this goes back to 12 years ago. I used to think there needs to be a cap on salaries and all of this, and I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. But now I don't care, because it's, hey, if you're a Christian and you actually know your pastor's salary, if he's making $7 million a year, I think that would probably rub you wrong. But you don't know it. The majority of people don't know it. And hey, if you think it's okay for your pastor to be making 15% of what comes into the church, that's on you. Into the institution, let's call it. That's on you. But we just want to bring the power back to the congregant in the donor's hands. In America, through 112 years of precedent, all the power has been siloed back at the top again. That's why reform is coming. It's systems reform.
And I think a series like yours is going to have a big part to play in the way people think about this stuff, the conversations, the transparency perhaps that churchgoers may demand and want of their leaders. But I want to ask you this, Nathan, as we wrap it up, to think about everything that you've seen, to think about all of the conversations that you've had in making this. Where do you sit now on what a life following Jesus and a life serving others is supposed to look like?
That's a brilliant question. I had to boil it down. And to go back, I had never read the Bible fully, cover to cover, until I started this show. And when I did it, I was like, oh, this is a different book than what I've been taught. And I've done 6 or 7 passes through. I've read all the supporting apocryphal literature and other writings. And it's very interesting my goal is to always go back. I want to get as close to Christ as possible. And it's really those apostolic fathers and what was happening those first few hundred years. And so we asked the question in the show, just like, what is a church? What is ministry? And I realized my only ministry was my daughter. Like, I didn't have the capacity to take on additional ministry outside of her. And I realized it was because and this is years ago, but I realized I did not understand myself. I did not have my house in order. I did not understand like Christ's teachings and how it applied to my life. And so I had to boil down ministry to its simplest form, which was me and my daughter. who she was a surprise, the best surprise of my life. And so that became my ministry. And then as I refined that system, I was able to add one more and one more. And I can live like Christ for my daughter, and I can teach her those Christ-centered values through my actions. And that's where, faith becomes action, is sometimes you have to boil it down to what is ministry. And my ministry was just my daughter for years. And now it's been able to expand a little bit. And I think we always use this term called local social capital in the show, because we do look at the nonprofit sector as a whole. And the IRS gave this definition, this tax exemption to organizations because they were building local social capital. Local meaning your local community, social meaning the welfare of the community, and capital meaning resource, time, energy, whatever that is. Most churches and nonprofits now look global. They've forgotten this idea of local social capital. And so I would say the nonprofits and the churches in the show that we present as good examples, they only care about their local social capital. Most of them don't have websites. They only care about their community where they can impact. And I think when Christ, you asked about like the church, the church is the body with Christ as the head. And it's like, if we focus just on what we're supposed to do in our community, God's got the rest. It's time for the church to say, God, like, we put our faith in you. You'll guide us. I want to focus on my local community, and you'll connect the global church, however you connect it. You don't need my help. But you know what? The homeless guy down the street needs my help. And single mothers need a place to put their kids while they go to work. And the prison needs people to go in and love on those prisoners. Oh, and the elderly community that no one goes to and visits anymore. Those elderly would love to play games with my daughter and I.
Yeah.
How do we start focusing on local social capital? And the church is primed for that, but the system is just missing the mark. The institution's missing the mark. So it's how do we get back to that? And I think if we all focused on our close-knit ministry, the world would look radically different.
And I'm so inspired by the fact that you're thinking about this and that you're bringing something to us that is going to help us think about it as well, Nathan. So thank you so much for your time and for making the religion business as well.
Yeah, Laura, thank you so much for having me on. And I hope, hopefully it spurs some great dinner conversations around the world. That's the goal.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. You can stay up to date with what's happening with Nathan and the series at Religion Business on Instagram. You'll also find there some resources that Nathan and his team are working on to help churches with transparency and really be part of the solution to some of the things he's raised and not just be prompting conversation about change that needs to happen. So follow along. We can watch the series together with its expected April release date. And until then, enjoy living this undistracted life.